Insane, she muttered, her eyes scanning the screen. They've been doing this for years, decades even. How could no one have noticed? Jackson shook his head, his expression grim. They've kept it hidden, covered their tracks, and anyone who got too close, well, they didn't last long. Mara's mind flashed back to her father, his warnings, and the message he had sent her through the echoes. He had known about this, known the risks, the dangers, and he had tried to stop it. We have to stop them, she said again, her voice filled with determination. We have to find the core of the lattice and shut it down. Jackson nodded, but his expression was cautious. We can't rush into this. We need a plan, and we need to be prepared. If we go in without knowing what we're doing, we could make things worse. Mara knew he was right, but the urgency in her chest was hard to ignore. What do we do? She asked, her voice tight with frustration. Jackson was silent for a moment, then he spoke. We need to find someone who knows more about temporal lattices, someone who can help us understand what we're dealing with. There's only one person I know who might have that knowledge, but it's risky. Mara looked at him, her eyes narrowing. Who? Jackson hesitated, then replied, Dr. Alara Cade. She was a leading researcher in temporal physics before she vanished. The rumor is she was recruited by the rogue faction, but no one's seen her in years. If she's still alive, she might be our best chance. Mara nodded slowly, her mind racing. Where do we find her? Jackson sighed. That's the tricky part. If she's hiding, it won't be easy. But I have a few leads, places she was known to frequent, old contacts who might know something. It's a long shot, but it's all we've got. Mara took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. They were venturing into uncharted territory, facing forces beyond their understanding. But she couldn't back down now, not when the fate of reality itself was at stake. Let's find her, she said, her voice steady. And let's end this. Jackson nodded. They began to plan their next move, the weight of their mission heavy on their shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but they knew they had to see it through. For her father, for the truth, for the future. Mara and Jackson worked through the night, gathering what they could from the data on the secure drive and preparing for their search for Dr. Alara Cade. As the morning light seeped through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, Mara felt a mix of exhaustion and adrenaline. They had to move quickly. Every moment they delayed gave the rogue faction more time to alter the timeline. Jackson leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. We've got a few leads on where Dr. Cade might be. She was last seen in the outskirts of the city, near the old research districts. If she's hiding, that's where she'd be. Mara nodded, staring at the files spread out before her. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something, a crucial piece of the puzzle that could help them understand the full scope of Project Echo. The strange echo pattern she had seen in the control room continued to haunt her thoughts. Why did it feel so familiar? We need to find her, Mara said, determination hardening her voice. She's our only chance to understand what's happening and how to stop it. Jackson agreed, packing up the equipment they had used to analyze the files. We should leave as soon as possible. The longer we stay here, the more likely the agency will track us down. If they find us, they won't hesitate to silence us permanently. Mara stood, wincing slightly as the pain in her side flared up again. She had dressed the wound as best as she could with the limited supplies in the safe house, but she knew it wouldn't hold forever. Still, she pushed the pain to the back of her mind, focusing on the task ahead. As they prepared to leave, a low, rumbling noise filled the room, causing the walls to tremble slightly. Mara and Jackson exchanged a worried glance, instinctively ducking down and drawing their weapons. The noise grew louder, reverberating through the old building. "What is that?" Mara whispered, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. Jackson shook his head, frowning. "I don't know. It sounds like—" Before he could finish, the noise abruptly stopped, replaced by a strange, disorienting hum. Mara felt a chill run down her spine, her skin tingling as if a static charge was building in the air. Then, without warning, the room was bathed in an eerie blue light, and a figure appeared in the center of the room, a woman, her form flickering like a ghost. Mara's heart skipped a beat. The woman's features were sharp and angular, her eyes piercing and intelligent. She wore a lab coat over a simple outfit, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. There was something familiar about her, a face Mara had seen before in old files and faded photographs. "Dr. Alara Cade," Jackson breathed, lowering his weapon slightly. The figure's eyes focused on Mara and Jackson, her expression calm but serious. "You must listen to me," she said, her voice distorted by the echo that seemed to surround her. "There isn't much time." Mara stepped forward, her mind racing with questions. "Dr. Cade, how are you here? Are you an echo?" The figure nodded slightly. "Yes and no. I am a temporal projection, a warning sent from another point in time. The lattice is collapsing. The rogue faction's experiments are destabilizing the temporal fabric. If they continue, all realities will converge and collapse into a singularity." Mara's breath caught in her throat. "What does that mean? How do we stop it?" Dr. Cade's figure flickered, her form wavering as if struggling to maintain its coherence. "You must find the core of the temporal lattice. It's a device called the Chronon Nexus. It's the source of their power, the anchor point for their manipulations. Destroy it, and the lattice will unravel." Jackson stepped closer, his face tense. "Where is the Nexus? How do we find it?" Dr. Cade's expression darkened. "It's hidden within the heart of the agency, in a facility buried deep beneath Sector 17. You'll need access codes, clearance, resources you don't have. But there's another way." Mara leaned forward, hanging on every word. "What is it? What's the other way?" Dr. Cade's gaze met Mara's, her eyes filled with urgency. "There's a failsafe, a hidden code built into the lattice itself. Your father embedded it before he disappeared. It's a backdoor, a way to shut down the Nexus remotely. But to activate it, you'll need to trigger a specific echo pattern, the one you saw in the control room. It's a key, a signal that will unlock the failsafe." Mara's heart pounded in her chest. Her father had known. He had planned for this, prepared a way to stop the rogue faction, even if it meant sacrificing himself. "How do we trigger the pattern?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Dr. Cade's figure began to flicker more violently, her form destabilizing. "The pattern is encoded in a specific frequency, a quantum signal embedded in a hidden file. You have it on your drive, but you'll need to decode it, and you must hurry. The lattice is weakening. If it collapses completely—" Her words were cut off as her figure dissolved into a cascade of blue light, the room plunging back into darkness. The eerie hum faded, leaving only the distant rumble of the city outside. For a moment, Mara and Jackson stood in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. The weight of Dr. Cade's warning hung heavy in the air. "We have to find that signal," Mara said finally, her voice filled with determination. "We have to decode it and trigger the failsafe before it's too late." Jackson nodded, his expression grim. "Agreed, but it won't be easy. The drive's encrypted, and we're running out of time. We need a secure location to work from, somewhere the agency can't find us." Mara thought for a moment, then her eyes lit up. "There's an old communication bunker outside the city, abandoned for years. My father used to take me there when I was a child. It's off the grid, and the equipment there should be enough to decode the signal." Jackson nodded. "Sounds like our best bet. Let's move." They gathered their gear and left the safe house, moving quickly through the back streets and alleyways. Mara's mind was racing, her thoughts consumed by Dr. Cade's warning and the urgency of their mission. The Chronon Nexus, the temporal lattice, the rogue faction's experiments, it all seemed like a nightmare from which there was no waking. But she knew they had to keep going. Her father had given his life to stop this madness, and now it was up to her to finish what he had started. After a tense journey through the city's outskirts, they reached the old communication bunker. It was a small, unassuming building, half buried in the earth and overgrown with weeds. Mara led Jackson to a hidden entrance, a metal hatch covered with dirt and debris. She cleared it away and pulled the hatch open, revealing a narrow ladder leading down into darkness. "Here we go," Mara said, taking a deep breath. "This place should still have power. If we're lucky, we can get the old systems running." Jackson nodded, following her down the ladder into the bunker. The air inside was cool and musty, the walls lined with old equipment and wires. Mara made her way to a central console, wiping away a thick layer of dust and grime. She flipped a series of switches, and with a low hum, the bunker's lights flickered on, casting a dim glow over the room. "Let's see what we're working with." Jackson said, moving to another console and powering it up. The old monitors flickered to life, displaying a series of outdated command prompts and system diagnostics. Mara inserted the secure drive into the terminal, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she began the decryption process. The files on the drive were heavily encrypted, layered with complex algorithms and quantum locks. It would take time to break through, but Mara was determined. She had to be. As she worked, Jackson monitored the bunker's systems, checking for any signs of surveillance or tracking. The agency had vast resources and technology at its disposal, but this bunker was a relic of a bygone era, off the grid and out of sight. Hours passed, the tension in the room thickening with each passing moment. Mara's eyes were locked on the screen, her mind focused on the task at hand. She felt the weight of her father's legacy on her shoulders, the responsibility of carrying out his final mission. Finally, with a soft beep, the terminal displayed a series of decoded files. Mara's heart skipped a beat as she opened them, her eyes scanning the contents. "There it is," she said quietly, pointing to a file labeled Quantum Signal, Pattern 47. "That's the signal Dr. Cade mentioned, the key to triggering the failsafe." Jackson moved to her side, studying the file. "We need to transmit this signal through the lattice. If we can find a way to broadcast it on the right frequency, it should reach the Chronon Nexus and activate the failsafe." Mara nodded, her mind racing. "But how do we get it through the lattice? The agency's systems are locked down tight. We'd need access to their main communication hub, and that's deep inside their headquarters." Jackson frowned, thinking, "There might be another way. If we can find an echo that matches the frequency of the signal, we could use it as a carrier wave. Send the signal through the echo, and it could bypass their security." Mara considered the idea, her brow furrowing. "It's risky, but it might just work. We need to find an echo with the right frequency, one that's already in the lattice." Jackson nodded. "I'll start searching the database. It's a long shot, but it's the only shot we've got." As Jackson began his search, Mara stared at the terminal, her mind filled with thoughts of her father, Dr. Cade, and the rogue faction's experiments. The fate of reality itself hung in the balance, and they were running out of time. "We'll find a way," she whispered to herself, determination hardening in her voice. "We have to." The old communication bunker buzzed with energy as Mara and Jackson worked tirelessly, their fingers flying over the keyboards, their eyes glued to the screens. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old electronics, but neither of them noticed. They were focused on one thing, finding the right echo to transmit the quantum signal and activate the failsafe. Mara felt a sense of urgency pressing down on her like a weight. The image of Dr. Alara Cade's projection flickered in her mind, her warning about the collapse of the temporal lattice echoing over and over. If they couldn't find a way to broadcast the signal, everything would be lost. All realities converging into a singularity, the timeline collapsing on itself. Her father's sacrifice, the risks they had taken, it would all be for nothing. Jackson's voice broke the silence, his tone edged with excitement. "I think I've found something," he said, looking up from his terminal. "An echo with a frequency that matches the quantum signal, almost perfectly." Mara moved over to his side, glancing at the screen. The data displayed showed an echo originating from a point in the past, its frequency almost identical to the one they needed to transmit the failsafe. "Where is it coming from?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Jackson tapped a few keys, bringing up a more detailed analysis. "It's from over 40 years ago, right around the time your father first started working with the agency. The echo is faint, but it's stable. It's been looping through the lattice for decades, unnoticed." Mara's heart skipped a beat. 40 years ago? That's when my father first began his experiments with echoes. It can't be a coincidence. Jackson nodded. If he knew about the rogue faction even then, he might have embedded the signal in an echo as a contingency plan, something that would stay hidden until it was needed. Mara's mind raced with possibilities. Her father had always been cautious, always planning for every outcome. It made sense that he would have left a back door, a way to shut down the rogue faction's manipulations if things went too far. And now, after all these years, they had found it. "We need to lock onto that echo," Mara said, determination sharpening her voice. We have to send the quantum signal through it and trigger the failsafe. It's our only chance. Jackson nodded, his fingers moving rapidly over the keyboard. I'm locking onto the echo now. It's a delicate process, too much interference, and the whole thing could destabilize. Mara held her breath, watching as Jackson worked. The screen filled with complex algorithms and streams of data, the echo's frequency wavering slightly as Jackson carefully adjusted the settings. The bunker was silent, the tension palpable, every second stretching into eternity. Finally, Jackson leaned back, a look of satisfaction on his face. Got it. The echo is locked in. We're ready to transmit the signal. Mara felt a surge of relief, but she knew the hardest part was still ahead. Let's do it, she said, her voice steady. Send the signal. Jackson nodded, typing in the final command. The screen blinked, and a progress bar appeared, slowly filling as the quantum signal was encoded into the echo. Mara watched, her heart pounding in her chest, every second feeling like an hour. As the progress bar neared completion, the bunker's lights flickered, and a low hum filled the air. Mara and Jackson exchanged a worried glance, the tension in the room escalating. Something was happening, something they hadn't anticipated. Before they could react, a blinding flash of light filled the room, and a wave of energy surged through the bunker, knocking them both off their feet. Mara hit the ground hard, the air driven from her lungs. She gasped, struggling to breathe, her vision swimming. When the light faded, Mara blinked, trying to clear her head. She felt a strange sensation, a pull, like she was being drawn towards something. The walls of the bunker seemed to waver, shifting and distorting as if reality itself was bending. Jackson scrambled to his feet, his face pale. What the hell was that? He shouted, his voice barely audible over the strange humming that filled the room. Mara pushed herself up, her body aching. I don't know, she replied, her voice shaky. But it felt like the lattice was reacting to the signal, like it was fighting back. Jackson's eyes widened. The lattice is more unstable than we thought. Sending the signal might have triggered a defensive response. If the lattice collapses while we're still connected... Mara didn't need him to finish the thought. If the lattice collapsed, they would be caught in the temporal convergence, their existence erased along with the rest of reality. We have to shut it down, Mara said urgently, moving back to her terminal. We need to disconnect the signal before it's too late. Jackson nodded, rushing to his terminal. I'm on it, but it's going to take a minute to override the connection. As they worked frantically to sever the link, the bunker's walls continued to warp and shift, the air growing heavy with a strange electric charge. Mara's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of fear and determination. They were so close to shutting down the rogue faction's manipulations, to stopping the temporal collapse. Suddenly the hum intensified, and the room was flooded with a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through Mara's very bones. She felt a sharp pain in her head, her vision blurring again as the world around her seemed to split apart. And then, without warning, the sound stopped and everything went still. Mara blinked, her senses reeling. The bunker was gone. She was standing in a vast open space, a void, empty and silent. The air was thick and heavy, pressing down on her like a weight. She turned, looking for Jackson, but he was nowhere to be seen. Hello? She called out, her voice echoing strangely in the emptiness. Jackson, are you there? There was no answer. Mara's heart pounded in her chest, panic rising. Where was she? What had happened? Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged, a tall, slender man with a calm, composed demeanor. He was dressed in a simple suit, his hair neatly combed. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and Mara felt a strange familiarity about him, as if she had seen him before. Who are you? Mara demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The man smiled slightly, his expression serene. I am the Guardian, he said, his voice smooth and measured. I exist within the temporal lattice. I am its protector. Mara frowned, confusion mingling with fear. The Guardian? Protector of what? The lattice, the Guardian replied, the fabric of time itself. It is my duty to maintain its integrity, to ensure that reality remains stable. Mara's mind raced. You're part of the lattice? An echo? The Guardian nodded. I am more than an echo. I am a manifestation of the lattice's core, its essence. I exist to preserve the balance of time to prevent its collapse. Mara's eyes widened. Then you know about the rogue faction? About their experiments? The Guardian's expression darkened. Yes, I am aware of their manipulations. They threaten the stability of the lattice, the very fabric of reality. They must be stopped. Mara felt a glimmer of hope. That's why I'm here. My father, he left a failsafe, a way to shut down the Chronon Nexus. We're trying to trigger it, to stop the rogue faction. The Guardian regarded her thoughtfully. Your father was wise, but his efforts may not be enough. The lattice is already weakened. The Nexus has grown too powerful. Its influence reaches across all realities. Mara's heart sank. What can we do? How do we stop it? The Guardian's gaze softened. There is a way, but it is not without risk. You must go to the core of the Nexus, to the heart of the lattice itself. Only there can you disrupt its power, sever its connection to the timeline. Mara nodded, determination hardening her resolve. Then that's what we'll do. Tell me how to get there. The Guardian extended a hand, and a small, glowing orb appeared in his palm. Take this, he said, holding it out to Mara. It is a beacon, a guide. It will lead you to the core, but you must hurry. The lattice is unstable. Time is running out. Mara took the orb, feeling its warmth in her hand. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. We'll do whatever it takes. The Guardian nodded, his expression grave. Go quickly, and be careful. The path to the core is treacherous. You will face many dangers, but you must not falter. The fate of all realities rests in your hands. Mara nodded, steeling herself for what lay ahead. She turned, and the void around her began to shift, the darkness giving way to light. She felt herself being pulled back, the sensation of movement returning as the world around her blurred and reformed. And then, with a jolt, she was back in the bunker, the hum of machinery filling her ears. Jackson was by her side, his face pale but determined. Mara, what happened? He asked, his voice filled with concern. You just disappeared. Mara shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. I saw a guardian, a protector of the lattice. He told me how to get to the core, to stop the Nexus. Jackson's eyes widened. The core, how do we get there? Mara held up the glowing orb. With this, it's a beacon, a guide. It'll lead us to the core, but we have to move fast. The lattice is collapsing. We don't have much time. Jackson nodded, his expression resolute. Then let's go. We've come this far. No turning back now. Mara nodded, and together they prepared for the final leg of their journey, the weight of their mission heavy on their shoulders. The path ahead was uncertain, the dangers unknown, but they were ready. They had to be. The fate of all realities depended on it. The bunker's heavy door creaked open, revealing the dim alley outside. Mara and Jackson moved swiftly, keeping low to avoid detection. The streets were quiet in the early morning light, but they knew the rogue faction's agents could be anywhere, searching for them. The glowing orb in Mara's hand pulsed softly, its light guiding them toward the core of the temporal lattice, the Chronon Nexus. We have to move fast, Jackson whispered, glancing around nervously. If the agency realizes we've left the bunker, they'll tighten security around Sector 17. We need to get there before they lock it down completely. Mara nodded, feeling the pressure of their mission weighing heavily on her. Every second counted. The Nexus had to be shut down before the lattice collapsed and converged all realities into a singularity. The thought of everything and everyone she knew being erased drove her forward, even as exhaustion clawed at her. Following the orb's glow, they navigated the twisting back streets and narrow alleyways, avoiding the main roads where security drones patrolled. They kept a low profile, moving quickly and quietly through the shadows. Finally, they reached the perimeter of Sector 17, its high walls looming before them. Beyond those walls lay the core of the lattice and the rogue faction's most guarded secret. Jackson pulled a small device from his pocket, a signal jammer designed to temporarily disable electronic surveillance. This should give us a few minutes to get past the outer defenses, he said, activating the jammer. A soft buzz filled the air as the device came to life. Mara took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. Let's do this, she said, determination etched into her features. They climbed over a section of the wall where the security was weakest, landing silently on the other side. The compound beyond was a maze of steel and concrete, with high fences topped with razor wire and guard towers overlooking every corner. Mara felt a pang of fear, but she pushed it aside. They had come too far to turn back now. The orb pulsed faster, its light intensifying as they moved deeper into Sector 17. It seemed to pull them forward, guiding them through the maze of corridors and security checkpoints. They moved quickly, their footsteps light and cautious, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the guards. Patrol routes. At last, they reached a large reinforced door marked Chronon Nexus Access. Mara's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the entrance to the core, the place where the rogue faction controlled the timeline. Jackson approached a control panel beside the door, his fingers moving swiftly over the keys. "I'll override the security system," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This could take a few minutes. Keep watch." Mara nodded, positioning herself to keep an eye on the corridor. She could feel the tension in the air, the sense that they were on the brink of something monumental. She clutched the orb tightly in her hand, its glow a comforting presence in the dark, sterile hallway. As Jackson worked, a soft beep sounded from the panel, and the door slid open with a quiet hiss. "Got it," he said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "We're in." They slipped through the door, entering a vast chamber filled with machinery and consoles, the walls lined with glowing screens displaying a bewildering array of data. In the center of the room stood a massive, cylindrical device, a towering structure of metal and light that hummed with a low, resonant frequency. Mara felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. This was the Chronon Nexus, the heart of the temporal lattice. Mara and Jackson approached the Nexus cautiously, the orb in Mara's hand pulsing rapidly now, its light almost blinding. She could feel the power emanating from the device, a tangible force that seemed to warp the very air around them. "This is it," Jackson said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the Nexus. "We need to find the control panel. If we can input the signal from the orb, it should trigger the failsafe and shut down the lattice." Mara nodded, scanning the room for anything that resembled a control interface. She spotted a console on the far side of the chamber, its surface covered with glowing buttons and switches. "There," she said, pointing. They made their way to the console, Mara's heart pounding with anticipation. As they reached it, she set the orb down on the console's surface, its light casting long shadows across the room. Jackson began typing rapidly, his eyes focused on the screen as he navigated the complex system. Suddenly, the chamber's lights dimmed, and a loud alarm blared through the room. Mara's stomach dropped. "They know we're here," she said, panic rising in her chest. Jackson didn't look up. "I just need a few more seconds," he muttered, his fingers flying over the keys. Mara turned, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of the approaching guards. She could hear the distant sound of boots on metal, the echo of their approach growing louder. Her heart raced. They were running out of time. "Jackson," she urged, desperation creeping into her voice. "I'm almost there," he shouted, his tone tense. The doors to the chamber burst open, and a group of armed guards stormed in, their weapons raised. Mara ducked behind the console, drawing her own weapon. She fired a few shots, forcing the guards to take cover, but she knew it wouldn't hold them off for long. "Hurry," she yelled, her voice strained with fear. Jackson pressed a final key, and the screen flashed. "Got it," he shouted triumphantly. "The signal's transmitting." Mara felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The guards opened fire, energy pulses ricocheting off the metal surfaces of the chamber. Mara returned fire, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Just as she thought they were finished, the Nexus began to pulse with a strange, rhythmic light, its hum growing louder and more intense. The guards faltered, looking around in confusion. "What's happening?" Jackson asked, his voice filled with a mix of awe and fear. Mara didn't have an answer. The Nexus's light grew brighter, filling the room with a blinding glow. The air crackled with energy, and Mara felt a strange sensation, a pulling, twisting feeling, like the very fabric of reality was being stretched and distorted. The guards screamed, their forms flickering and blurring as if they were being pulled apart. Mara watched in horror as they seemed to dissolve into the air, their bodies disintegrating into particles of light. "What's going on?" Jackson shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening hum of the Nexus. Mara's eyes widened with realization. "The lattice! It's collapsing!" Jackson turned to her, fear etched into his features. "We need to get out of here." Before they could move, the room was engulfed in a brilliant white light, and Mara felt herself being lifted off her feet, the world around her spinning and twisting in a dizzying vortex of light and sound. She tried to scream, but her voice was lost in the maelstrom. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The light faded, and Mara found herself lying on a cold, hard surface. She blinked, disoriented, her body aching. Slowly she pushed herself up, looking around. She was no longer in the chamber. The room was different, familiar, but different. It was the control room they had entered earlier, but it was older. The walls were worn, the equipment outdated. It was as if she had stepped back in time. "Mara," Jackson's voice called out, weak and distant. She turned and saw him lying a few feet away, struggling to sit up. She rushed over to him, helping him to his feet. "Are you okay?" He nodded, though he looked shaken. "I think so. What just happened?" Mara shook her head, trying to make sense of it. "I don't know. It's like we were pulled through time." Jackson's eyes widened. "The lattice, it must have collapsed partially, creating a temporal shift. We've been thrown into a different point in time." Mara's heart pounded in her chest. "When? How far back are we?" Before Jackson could answer, a voice echoed through the room, a calm, steady voice that sent chills down Mara's spine. "You shouldn't be here." Mara and Jackson turned to see a man standing at the far end of the room, his face hidden in shadow. He stepped forward, and Mara's breath caught in her throat. It was her father. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. Dr. Marcus Ellison looked at her, his expression calm but serious. "Mara," he said softly, "I knew you'd come." Mara felt a flood of emotions, shock, confusion, hope. How are you here? Where are we?" Dr. Ellison stepped closer, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "We're in the past, my past, before I disappeared. The failsafe you triggered, it brought you here, to this moment." Mara's mind reeled. But why? Why here? Why now? Her father's gaze was intense. Because this is where it all began. The Nexus, the lattice, the manipulations. This is where they started, and this is where they must end. Jackson stepped forward, his voice urgent. "But the Nexus, the lattice, it's collapsing. We need to shut it down before it's too late." Dr. Ellison nodded. "I know, and that's why you're here. There's only one way to stop it now, to sever the connection completely." Mara frowned, her heart aching. "What do you mean?" Her father's eyes met hers, filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. "You have to destroy the core. The Nexus must be dismantled, piece by piece. It's the only way to ensure the lattice doesn't collapse completely and take all realities with it." Mara's breath caught in her throat. "But that could destroy everything, including us." Dr. Ellison nodded solemnly. "I know, but it's a risk we have to take. I've been preparing for this moment for a long time, Mara. I've left instructions, blueprints, everything you need to do it right. But you have to act quickly. The lattice won't hold for much longer." Mara's mind raced, fear and determination clashing within her. She had come so far, fought so hard the rogue faction and save reality. Now, faced with the ultimate sacrifice, she felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. Jackson placed a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. We've come this far together. We'll see it through." Mara looked at him, then back at her fa. There. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what had to be done. "Okay," she said quietly. "Tell us what we need to do." Dr. Ellison nodded, a look of pride in his eyes. "Follow me," he said, turning toward a door at the far end of the room. "We have a lot of work to do, and not much time to do it." As they followed him into the depths of the facility, Mara felt a sense of resolve settle in her chest. The path ahead was uncertain, the risks immense, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. They were the last hope for reality, and they would do whatever it took to save it, no matter the cost. Mara followed her father down a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly, lit only by flickering overhead lights. The walls were lined with exposed pipes and wires, giving the space an unfinished, almost abandoned feel. She glanced back at Jackson, who gave her a reassuring nod, but she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. They were about to undertake a mission that could end not just their lives, but the very fabric of reality itself. Dr. Marcus Ellison led them to a large steel door at the end of the corridor. He placed his hand on a biometric scanner, and after a moment, the door slid open with a heavy groan. They stepped inside a massive chamber that housed the core of the Chronon Nexus. The room was dominated by a colossal machine that extended from the floor to the ceiling. humming with an ominous energy. The core was a tangle of circuits and glowing conduits, pulsing with a steady, rhythmic light. It looked almost alive. "This is the heart of the Nexus," Dr. Ellison said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "It's what allows the rogue faction to manipulate time, create alternate realities, and control the timeline. To stop them, we need to dismantle it, destroy the lattice that holds it together." Mara stared at the core, a mix of awe and fear swelling within her. She could feel the power radiating from it, like a gravitational force pulling her in. It was overwhelming to think that this machine was capable of bending time, of reshaping reality itself. "Where do we start?" Jackson asked, moving closer to examine the structure. "How do we take it apart without causing a complete collapse of the lattice?" Dr. Ellison pointed to a series of panels on the side of the core. "We need to sever the primary connections first. These are the conduits that link the Nexus to the temporal lattice. Once they're disconnected, the core will be isolated, and we can begin to dismantle it. But you have to be careful. If the wrong sequence is triggered, it could destabilize the entire structure." Mara nodded, feeling the weight of the task ahead. "How do we know which ones to disconnect?" Dr. Ellison walked over to a console near the core, typing in a series of commands. A holographic display appeared above the console, showing a detailed schematic of the core and its connections. "I've marked the critical points on this map. Follow it carefully. One wrong move, and it could be catastrophic." Jackson moved to another console, pulling up the same schematic on a different screen. "I'll handle the secondary systems," he said, glancing at Mara. "You take the primary conduits. We'll have to work in tandem to keep the lattice stable." Mara took a deep breath, steeling herself for the task ahead. "Got it," she replied, moving to the first panel. She opened it carefully, revealing a complex network of wires and circuits. She could feel the hum of energy coursing through them, like a heartbeat. She followed her father's instructions, carefully disconnecting the first set of wires. Sparks flew as she pulled them apart, but the core remained stable. She moved to the next panel, repeating the process. With each connection she severed, she felt the tension in the air increase, as if the very fabric of reality was holding its breath. Jackson worked quickly at his console, his fingers flying over the keys. "I'm disabling the secondary stabilizers," he called out, his voice tense. "This should give us a few more minutes before the core starts to destabilize." Mara nodded, focusing on her task. She had to trust that Jackson knew what he was doing. There was no room for doubt now, not when so much was at stake. As she disconnected the final conduit, a loud alarm blared through the chamber, and the core's pulsing light began to flicker erratically. Mara's heart pounded in her chest. "What's happening?" she shouted, looking to her father. Dr. Ellison's face was grim. "The core is trying to compensate for the loss of power. We need to initiate the shutdown sequence now, before it overrides the failsafe." Jackson's eyes widened. "But if we do that, it could trigger a collapse in the lattice. We could lose everything." Dr. Ellison nodded. "I know, but it's the only way to stop the rogue faction's manipulations. If we don't shut it down, the timeline will be forever compromised. All realities could converge into a singularity." Mara's mind raced. They were out of time, out of options. She had to make a choice, and quickly. "What about the failsafe code you mentioned? Can we still use it?" Dr. Ellison hesitated, then shook his head. "The failsafe was meant to be a last resort, a way to sever the Nexus's connection to the lattice if all else failed. But with the core already destabilizing, there's no guarantee it will work. It could just as easily accelerate the collapse." Mara looked between her father and Jackson, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She thought of everything they had been through, the echoes, the warnings, the danger. She thought of her father's sacrifice, of the lives that would be lost if they failed. "We have to try," she said finally, her voice firm. "If there's even a chance the failsafe can work, we have to take it. It's the only way to stop them." Dr. Ellison nodded, a look of pride and sadness in his eyes. "I trust your judgment, Mara. Whatever happens, know that I'm proud of you, of the person you've become." Mara felt a lump form in her throat, but she pushed it down. There was no time for emotions now. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. "I'll see this through, I promise." She turned to Jackson, who was already preparing the failsafe code. "Are you ready?" Jackson nodded, his face set in determination. Let's do this. Dr. Ellison moved to a final console, inputting a series of commands. When I give the signal, activate the code. The core will try to resist, but it should trigger a cascade failure in the lattice, severing its connection to the timeline. Mara and Jackson positioned themselves at their consoles, fingers poised over the keys. The room was filled with the hum of the Nexus, its light flickering wildly. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching into eternity. Now! Dr. Ellison shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. Mara and Jackson activated the failsafe code simultaneously. The room shook violently, and the core's light flared to an intense, blinding brightness. The air crackled with energy, and Mara felt a surge of power wash over her, like a tidal wave of force. The core's hum grew louder, rising to a deafening roar. The walls of the chamber trembled, and the floor beneath them cracked and buckled. Mara struggled to keep her balance, her hands gripping the console. "Hold on," Dr. Ellison shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "The lattice is collapsing. We're almost there." Mara's vision blurred, the world around her twisting and warping. She felt a strange sensation, like she was being pulled in multiple directions at once. Time seemed to stretch and bend, moments blending together in a dizzying array of light and sound. And then, with a final shattering explosion of light, the core went dark. The room was plunged into silence, the hum of the Nexus fading away to nothing. Mara blinked, disoriented. The bar was still, the machinery silent. She could feel the ground beneath her, solid and unmoving. She glanced at Jackson, who was breathing heavily, his face pale but relieved. Did it work?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Ellison nodded, a faint smile on his face. "Yes, Mara, it worked. The lattice is severed. The Nexus is shut down." Mara felt a wave of relief wash over her, her body sagging with exhaustion. They had done it. They had stopped the rogue faction, shut down the Nexus, and saved the timeline. But as the relief settled in, a new feeling emerged, one of loss. She turned to her father, tears welling up in her eyes. "What happens now?" Dr. Ellison's expression softened. "Now, the timeline begins to heal. The damage we've done, the changes, they'll start to correct themselves. But there's something you need to know, Mara." Mara's heart sank. "What is it?" Dr. Ellison stepped closer, his eyes filled with a deep, unspoken sadness. "When the lattice severed, it created a temporal divide. You and Jackson, you're out of sync with the timeline now. To restore balance, you'll have to return to your original time." Mara's eyes widened, her mind reeling. "But that means you won't be there. I'll lose you again." Her father nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I'm afraid so, but you'll have the memories, the knowledge of we've accomplished here. That's more than most people ever get. And you'll know that you made a difference, that you saved reality." Mara felt her heart break, but she knew he was right. She had to go back, to restore the timeline, to ensure that all they had done wasn't for nothing. She wiped away her tears, steeling herself for what lay ahead. "I love you, Dad," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for everything." Dr. Ellison smiled, his face soft with love and pride. "I love you too, Mara, always. Now go. Go and live your life. Make it a good one." Mara nodded, turning to Jackson. "Are you ready?" Jackson gave her a solemn nod. "Let's go." They moved to the center of the chamber, where a faint, shimmering portal had begun to form, a doorway back to their original time. Mara took one last look at her father, committing his face to memory, then stepped through the portal, Jackson by her side. As the portal closed behind them, Mara felt a surge of energy, the world around her spinning and shifting. And then, with a soft pop, they were back in the bunker, the hum of the machines filling the air. Mara blinked, disoriented. The room was the same as it had been before, dim, musty, filled with old equipment. She turned to Jackson, who was looking around with a mixture of relief and confusion. "We're back," Jackson said, his voice filled with awe. "It's over." Mara nodded, feeling a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a sense of closure. They had done what they came to do. They had saved the timeline, but the cost had been high. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "Thank you, Jackson," she said softly, "for everything." Jackson gave her a small smile. "Thank you, Mara. We did it together." Mara nodded, and together they left the bunker, stepping out into the bright light of the new day. The world around them was the same, yet different, a reality restored, a timeline saved. As they walked away, Mara felt a sense of peace settle over her. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but she also knew that she had the strength to face them. She had her memories, her experiences, and the knowledge that she had made a difference. And that was enough. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the city as Mara and Jackson made their way through the bustling streets. Everything seemed to have returned to normal, but to Mara, it all felt surreal. The weight of their journey, of the sacrifices made and the battles fought, lingered in her mind. She had saved reality, yet she couldn't shake the feeling of loss, of leaving her father behind in that fractured moment in time. As they walked, Jackson glanced at her, his face thoughtful. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently. Mara offered a small, tired smile. "I'm okay, I think. It's just a lot to process. We saved the timeline, but it doesn't feel like a victory." "Not really." Jackson nodded, understanding. "I know what you mean. It's hard to reconcile everything we've been through. But you did something incredible, Mara. You saved countless lives, countless realities. That has to count for something." Mara appreciated his words, but the ache in her heart remained. She missed her father, missed the chance to be with him again, to ask him all the questions that had haunted her for years. But she knew he had made his choice, just as she had made hers. They had both done what needed to be done. They continued walking until they reached a quiet park on the outskirts of the city. The trees were tall and old, their leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze. A small, secluded bench sat beneath one of the larger trees, and Mara and Jackson took a seat, the weight of their journey settling over them. For a while, they sat in silence, watching the world go by. The ordinary lives of people moving around them felt comforting, a reminder of what they had fought to protect. But Mara knew that her work wasn't finished. Not yet. "There's something I need to do," she said quietly, breaking the silence. Jackson turned to her, curiosity in his eyes. "What is it?" Mara reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, portable terminal she had carried with her throughout their journey. She activated it, the screen flickering to life, and began typing in a series of commands. "I'm sending one final transmission," she explained, her voice calm but resolute. "A message to the past, just like my father did for me. It's a warning, a guide, for anyone who might find themselves in the same position we were in." Jackson watched her, understanding dawning in his expression. "You're making sure they have a chance. A way to stop it if it ever happens again." Mara nodded. "Exactly. The timeline might be stable now, but there's always a risk, always a chance that someone else might try to manipulate it. I want to make sure they know what we know, that they have the tools to fight back." She continued typing, her fingers moving quickly over the keys. The terminal's screen displayed a complex stream of data, the echo patterns and quantum signals that had been central to their mission. Mara encoded the failsafe, embedding it within the transmission, just as her father had done before. As she worked, memories of her father flooded her mind. The way he had guided her, protected her, even from beyond the grave. She wanted to honor his legacy, to ensure that his work wasn't forgotten. Finally, the transmission was ready. Mara took a deep breath, her hand hovering over the terminal's interface. "This is it," she said softly, "the ultimate transmission." Jackson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, Mara. Your father would be proud." Mara smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I hope so." With a final determined breath, she pressed the button, sending the transmission into the depths of the temporal lattice. The terminal hummed softly as the data was encoded into the quantum fabric of time, becoming part of the echoes that would one day guide another echo tuner, another hero, in their own battle to save reality. When the transmission was complete, the terminal's screen went dark, and Mara sat back, a sense of closure washing over her. She had done everything she could, everything her father had taught her. The rest was out of her hands. Jackson squeezed her shoulder, offering silent support. "What now?" he asked after a moment. Mara looked out at the park, at the trees swaying gently in the breeze, at the people going about their lives, unaware of the monumental battle that had just been fought to protect them. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill her lungs. "Now," she said, her voice steady, "we live. We move forward. We find a way to live in this world we've saved." Jackson smiled, a look of relief and gratitude in his eyes. I'd like that. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The world felt peaceful, the chaos of the past few days finally giving way to a quiet sense of hope. Mara knew there would be challenges ahead, there always were. But she also knew that she was stronger now, more resilient. She had faced the impossible and come out the other side. Whatever the future held, she was ready to face it. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Mara closed her eyes, letting the moment wash over her. She thought of her father, of the sacrifices he had made, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had given her the tools she needed to succeed, and she had done the same for others. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Mara felt at peace. She had made her choices, fought her battles, and saved the timeline. Now it was time to live. And she would live well, knowing that her father's legacy would continue to protect the timeline, ensuring that reality, in all its infinite possibilities, would endure.